So we're going to begin in the Monday sessions looking at the Sermon on the Mount. So how do we feel when we hear those words? Do we feel excited, or do we feel it might be a lot of sermons on a sermon? No. I think the Sermon on the Mount really needs rebranding, right? Because it sounds like it's going to be one of the longest and most tedious parts of the Bible. But actually, it's really not boring. It's kind of Jesus saying, this is what heaven will look like. And this is maybe the beginnings of how we get there. But unfortunately, because we have this title, the Sermon on the Mount, and we just imagine Jesus talking for hours and hours and hours, it doesn't always seem as exciting as it might be. So the Sermon on the Mount starts on a mountain. And in the Bible, whenever we have this picture of heaven touching earth, it often happens on a mountain. So we see Moses receive the 10 Commandments on the mountain coming straight from God. When Jesus goes through the transfiguration and he becomes glowing with the godliness of God, that also happens on the mountain. The mountain is a place where we can sort of begin to imagine what heaven looks like. And we have this sermon, which is probably lots of different bits of conversation over lots of days. And we have two different views on it. So we have one which is in Matthew and one which is in Luke. And people often look at them and say, oh, they're saying slightly different things. And today we're going to be talking about the Beatitudes. And in Matthew, they're just like blessings. But in Luke, he has every blessing has a woe to these. Matthew's is kind of more unapologetically good news, whereas Luke, he wants to have all the punches in that section. Now, overall, I'd say that both Matthew and Luke have all the same themes throughout the Sermon on the Mount. They just don't all bring them all into the beginning. So I guess what Matthew remembers is these are the instances of God smiling upon people, and that's the takeaway. Whereas Luke is kind of trying to hint at the whole picture. I mean, both of them have bits where they say that God is uncomfortable with people having too much wealth. So the people who say that in Matthew's gospel, that's not covered, they need to read the rest of the text, is my view. The other views are available. So we're going to look at this section, which is just from the Beatitudes.
Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you."
So that's partly why I think this may have been spread over several days, because even a little bit of that is enough to blow your mind, right? It's quite a lot to hear, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, because they're probably looking at that and thinking, I don't feel blessed, and this doesn't sound like something that would be a blessing to me. But I think if we kind of begin to unpack this, and we're only really going to look at one, because you could look at each of them in a huge depth, we're going to start to look at how these sayings have a great depth that could live with us for a whole day. A little bit like a proverb, something that you kind of chew over, and that it kind of gradually you understand more of it the more that you time chewing over it. So all of these sentences begin with the word blessed, which is the Greek word makarois. Now, do not trust me on pronunciation. Pronunciation of ancient languages is not my thing, but it sounds roughly like makarois. I'm not going to get you to say it back because I'm probably saying it wrong. Matt, how would you say it? Okay, well, that's all right. Okay, see? Oh, it is right. So it's makarois, which means blessed. Sometimes it's translated as happy are they. Now, personally, I'm not a big in favor of the happy are they, because when you look at the way that makarois is used throughout the Bible, it's sometimes used to like bless the house. And it doesn't really make sense to say happy is the house. Or maybe it does, but less sense to me. Blessing is a better word. It kind of contains more sense of God's involvement in it. And when you get to some of them, like blessed are those who mourn, happy are those who mourn is a little bit galling, I think. Whereas blessed are those who mourn is something I feel you could work on. And what does it mean? I think it kind of means, the phrase that Matt uses quite often is it means smile upon this situation, or God smiles upon this situation. Now, I think that's a beginning of how we think about blessing, but there's kind of a little bit more of a nugget in there. So for me, a blessing, like a smile from God, is a gift that kind of comes with a responsibility. A bit like, if you're very talented at something, you need to kind of use that, because otherwise you'd be kind of squandering a gift that you're given. It's not like a difficult or impossible responsibility, receiving a blessing. But I think if you think about it as when someone smiles at you on the street and then you go and smile at the next person and everyone has a chain reaction, which means that there's a slightly better day going on, that's the kind of responsibility I think of a blessing. Or like being given like a little plant to look after. And it's a beautiful little plant, but it does need a little bit of watering and attention every now and again. So with that kind of in mind, that these are blessings that come with a sense of responsibility and that they are about making heaven come close to earth. Let's just look at just one of these. So that's blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, from Matthew 5:3. So we start by thinking this poor in spirit phrase, what does that mean? There are lots of things you could think. Does it just mean someone who's feeling a bit downbeat that week? But with all of the things that Jesus is saying, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, he's often talking about other passages of Scripture, which is why it's really, really great if you can get a copy of the Voice Translation Bible, because it's not the best Bible in the world, but it does tell you when Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament, which is very helpful, I find. So when he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, this is kind of a reference, among other things, to Jeremiah 66:2, where God says to Jeremiah, who is in a bad place, really, has not my hand made all these things, so they came into being, declares the Lord. These are the ones I look on with favor, those who are humble and contrite in spirit, who tremble at my word. And when we look at this passage with the other passage, it kind of opens it up a bit. So those we look on with favor, those who are blessed, is kind of the same thing. Bit more going on with blessing, perhaps. Who are humble and contrite in spirit. And I think when we think about poor in spirit or humble and contrite in spirit, I think what we're really talking about is people who recognize that they depend on God. That everything they have comes from God, and that if they receive something from God, it's not just for them, it's also for everyone around them. And I think this doesn't just say, blessed are the poor, but I think when we hear just blessed are the poor, it's a bit dangerous sometimes, isn't it, really? Because poverty is something that you can romanticize, but the reality of living on the streets or not being able to feed your kids is not something we should romanticize or aspire to. We should aspire to a better world where everyone can feed their children and everyone has a house. That's my opinion anyway. But this idea of the poor in spirit, those who know they're dependent on God, that's kind of richer, because everything we have comes from God. And if we recognize that and our dependence on God, we become more aware of the blessings that we have. And if everything we have comes from God, these blessings are gifts and responsibilities. There are things that we couldn't achieve on our own. Like, we all went to schools where there was paper and there were books. And that is an amazing blessing that we receive just by being born into this country. And that blessing is a gift. And it is a responsibility. Or we're all here and able to come to church and worship freely. And that's a gift, and that's a responsibility too. But when we receive gifts like that, when we kind of are able to feed our kids and put food on the table and go to school, we have those blessings, those gifts from God. And we kind of have a responsibility to share that with those who don't have those blessings and those gifts. Because in God's world, in the kingdom of heaven, you are aware of the gap between what you could do on your own and what you can't do. So like if I hadn't been to school at all and all I'd been taught was farming, I'd be a really bad farmer. I've never managed to keep a plant alive. So I probably starve. But I have all of these blessings that have led me to where I am. But because I've got those things, I have a responsibility to ensure that other people can get to a place where they're able to get out and do things and see things, where they're able to make choices about their lives and eat. And if everything comes from God and we recognize that dependence, then our privilege becomes something that we can share with other people. So I think, the Bible has no problems with people making $1 million, but I think it has a lot of problems with people who keep $1 million. Because if you have £1 million in your bank account and you're living next to someone who's hungry, how does that sit with all of the message of love in the Bible? So I'd say that's a kind of insight into how you can begin to unpack a beatitude. There are basically some good questions that you can ask. So you can say, how is this a blessing? And how might that blessing be a responsibility? So blessed are those who mourn. How could mourning be a blessing? I guess being free to remember someone that has died. Perhaps you could talk about the memories of having loved someone, because loving someone is a privilege. I think having community around you so you can mourn publicly. But also, we'll hear the other promise that they'll be comforted. So there's a promise of heaven, a promise that this is not the end and that you'll see people again. But you have a responsibility to kind of share that message and comfort other people. But also to remember why what you have been given is a gift. So every time I see a beatitude, I ask, how is the blessing a responsibility? How does this scripture relate to other scriptures? And how does this good news make heaven possible on earth? And I guess when you take a teeny tiny beatitude and think about it, think, how am I poor in spirit? How do I know that I'm dependent on God? How do I share the gifts that God has given me in my life? How can I use that to bring heaven closer to earth? That's kind of just the introduction of where God is going with that.